From Recorded Future News, this is Click Here. Since the beginning of the year, small acts of sabotage have started appearing all over Europe. A massive fire engulfed a shopping center in Warsaw, Poland. In the UK, 2 men with alleged links to Russian intelligence were charged with setting fire to a warehouse filled with aid for Ukraine. In France, officials detained a Russian-Ukrainian man for allegedly building bombs.
An explosion just north of Paris, raising alarms over...
They discovered him only after he appeared to have accidentally detonated one of his devices.
After a homemade explosive device detonated in his hotel room near Charles de Gaulle Airport.
And then last week, Josep Borrell, the vice president of the European Commission, finally said out loud what many officials had been saying privately. These incidents were not isolated.
Russia, it is a security threat.
They all appeared to be tied to Russia, and they looked to be part of a campaign to rattle the EU and undermine its support for Ukraine. I'm Dina Temple-Raston, and this is Click Here, a podcast about all things cyber and intelligence. And today, Russia's aggression beyond Ukraine. I moderated a panel last week at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C., with 4 experts on Russia. And they talked about how individually these small-bore attacks across the continent seemed like random events. And then it became clear it's about something much bigger. Russia's hybrid battle against the West.
Right? So part of their objectives of all of these operations, I think, is to cause a general sense of chaos and fear and a degree of deterrence.
Stay with us. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Council on Foreign Relations meeting about Russian aggression beyond Ukraine. I'm Dina Temple-Raston. About 100 people gathered at the Council on Foreign Relations last week for a panel I moderated that was trying to make heads or tails of what the Russians are up to with these acts of arson and sabotage. The panel opened with Max Bergman from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's the director of the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program there.
I think Russia has contradictory goals, right? So they want to let Western governments know what they can do to our societies to make us sort of on edge, sort of nervous. On the other hand, they really want to weaken Western support for Ukraine. And so I think the most effective tactic that we've seen from them is actually the weaponized migration of flying in, oftentimes people from the Middle East, into Russia, into Belarus, and then trying to force them across the border and basically trying to use the migration issue, which is incredibly politically divisive, plays into the hands of the far right and to sort of weaken the West. But if Russia goes too far and is blowing up IKEAs across Europe, then this is where I think if Russia turns the dial up too fast and too hard, that can cause a blowback. And so they're, I think, going to be somewhat careful.
And Max said a big part of the problem is that the West is running out of things that they can do to change Russia's behavior.
In some ways, we have very little to deter them right now. We have sort of hit our deterrence button again and again, or we've released our whatever leverage we have in terms of sanctions, in terms of military support for Ukraine, in terms of evicting Russian diplomats, i.e. Russian spies in embassies. We've taken all these sort of traditional steps. And so now, essentially, the gloves are off.
He said an obvious possibility would be to change the rules of engagement in Ukraine. President Volodymyr Zelensky wants to use long-range weapons provided by the West to strike targets deep inside Russia. He says doing so will not only weaken Moscow's ability to strike Ukraine, but also force it to move its weapons further from the border. So far, President Biden has balked, partly because Russia has said removing the restrictions would be tantamount to an act of war, and the West would pay.
And so this is, I think, going to be a very tough problem for policymakers going forward.
I then turned to Adam Siegel to ask about how Russia is pairing these attacks on the ground around Europe with its cyber weapons. Adam heads up the Council on Foreign Relations Digital and Cyberspace Policy Program, and he says he puts Russia's cyber capabilities into 3 buckets.
So intel gathering, which has happened from before the war and continues, and it happens on a whole range of NATO and European targets. Preparation for and conducting disruptive and destructive attacks. So sometimes going after transportation networks, water, using ransomware for disruptive purposes. The cadence of those attacks seems to be going up. There's a group called Sandworm, which now seem to have a spin-off. They're called the Cyber Army of Russia Reborn. And then third, we're seeing information influence operations. And here the traditional hack and leak. So going after Moldova and other states that are having referendum, and then online influence operations. The most recent one that was exposed was Doppelganger, and so using fake websites to spread news and fake stories to undermine support for Ukraine and democracy.
To hear some people tell it, all this flurry of Russian activity against the West has emerged because of a reorganization at the GRU, Russia's military intelligence agency. It has allegedly stood up a new Special Activity Division, whose specialty are these kinds of chaos operations.
That's right. It's a new branch of the GRU that is being blamed for a lot of this activity.
This is Keir Giles. He's with Chatham House, an independent policy group based in London.
In the part, it's a spin-off from the Unit 29155, which has become notorious for gathering together a motley crew of psychopaths and cyber geeks to wreak mayhem across Europe in previous decades. But its role has supposedly expanded, and a lot of the attributed events that we've seen so far are being pinned on this organization. Now, I think there's a bit of a risk there that we may be in the same situation as we had when looking at the early stages of Russian online information operations, that if there's a label, if there's a name to which you can attach the blame for some of these things, then a lot more incidents get hung on them. And that tends to obscure that there's a much broader ecosystem across all the different intelligence agencies that are trying to do us harm. But Adam just referred to this nexus between the intelligence agencies and the criminal organizations. That has been more or less traditional in the cybersphere. Now we're seeing it expand into physical interventions across Europe, where the GRU and whoever else is behind this is not able to directly influence events in the target countries, partly because, of course, they have been expelled from those countries. They no longer have such a physical footprint. They are reaching out to recruit online amateurs, proxies, criminals, disaffected local citizens to carry out attacks on their behalf. These attacks that are publicly known about are just pinpricks. They're relatively insignificant.
Almost amateurish. Officials say the Kremlin is joining forces with local criminals and just paying them to do their dirty work. This should sound familiar to anyone tracking cybercrime. Common criminals launching attacks gives a patina of deniability. Keir says we might be able to learn a little more about how it all works when the cases go to trial.
Yes. Now, in different countries, of course, you have different degrees of transparency about what's going on. Traditionally, the frontline states, particularly Estonia and Latvia, are overt by default about releasing information about the campaigns that are being waged against their countries. And so it's from those countries that you actually see the greatest detail about how now the Russian intelligence agencies are going about recruiting these proxies and bringing people in to carry out attacks on their behalf. In other places, of course, it is far more discreet, it's far more covert, and you may not even get the information even after the detailed investigations come to light in court proceedings, because those court proceedings may be held in camera. So it's, as ever, a patchwork across Europe of different degrees of transparency, which in some cases serves to actually conceal the extent of the problem rather than bringing it to light.
Andrea Kendall-Taylor is from the Center for a New American Security, and she says that Russia's behavior is inspiring others. Efforts are coalescing around something she calls the axis of upheaval. Andrea worries that we're increasingly going to see China, North Korea, and Iran launching these same sort of short-of-war attacks.
And the more that Russia does in places with all of these sabotage campaigns and other things, it's basically an icebreaker that's paving the way for other actors to get in the game. And if we can't figure out an appropriate response, then my argument would be that other actors will be ever more emboldened to do the same. And so there has been just a plethora of information talking about, yes, we know what Russia is getting, but just as important as what Russia gets from Iran, North Korea, and China is what it's giving away in return. And we've had now senior US officials talking about the fact that Russia's giving China submarine technology, missile technology. We're only 2 years past that point, and we're here. And so I think we have to think very hard, both the Russia as an icebreaker and paving the path for others to get into the game, but also its direct enabling of our adversaries in ways that is increasing the military capabilities of all of our adversaries, while at the same time diluting the foreign policy tools that we have to confront them, like sanctions and other things.
Max Bergman says we can already see this domino effect happening with regard to meddling in U.S. elections.
Russia interfered in the U.S. election in 2016. That was a direct interference in U.S. elections in a very direct, in many ways, overt way, and in some ways has paved the ground for Iran to now hack the Trump campaign. I think in general, it's our elections are sort of too dispersed, and there's now too many voices for them to have a real impact when it comes to the social media space. I do think that the hack and leak operations are potentially more impactful, but now the press, I think, have become more resilient when it comes to that. So I think there's a fair degree of immunity that has been built up. I think we're in sort of a stronger position when it comes to political interference on one side, when it comes to, in part because our social media space, we now recognize that it's a cesspool and a disaster, when in 2016 we may not have appreciated that. I'm more concerned actually about European elections in various places, because in some ways they have more rigid rules. They have campaign financing rules, which is, I think, excellent, but that means that if you have a constrained regulatory environment and then one actor is getting funding, not that much, but a little bit on the side, that can make a big difference in elections that are actually incredibly regulated.
Keir, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, briefly, yes. See, looking at this from not just outside the room, but outside the country, it would be astonishing if Russia were not putting maximum effort now into preparing for the election, both to influence the result and also, if the result is not the one that they would like, to try to sow maximum chaos on the back of that, as Adam was just describing. And I'm slightly less optimistic about the operating environment for Russia, because you've also had the progressive dismantling within the US, so some of the defenses against the ways in which social media can be leveraged and against the ways in which disinformation can actually influence political processes, such as the attacks on the Global Engagement Center, the attacks on counter-disinformation initiatives. All of that is steadily dismantling the defenses that were put up in place after the recognition of what happened in the 2016 election. And so, yes, I would be very surprised if there were not hack, forge, dump attacks around the time of the election to try to swing the result one way or another. And the current status of particular social media, especially Twitter, which is now recognized as a playground for Russian information operations with none of the safeguards that were previously there, does have the potential to influence voters without necessarily having to reach into election vote counting machines.
As the panel came to a close, I wanted to turn toward potential solutions, starting again with Keir Giles of Chatham House.
Could you talk a little bit about what you see are the effective levers to try to make sure that this is cabined?
Well, first of all, let's talk about that patchwork of responses that you have across different countries. And one of the first steps that needs to be taken is greater public awareness of the threat, particularly in those countries which do not see themselves as traditional victims or traditional adversaries of Russia. Like, for example, Ireland, which has been in the headlines because of direct Russian political interference, subordinating members of the Dáil in Parliament, much to Irish people's surprise, because they don't think that they are going to be anywhere near the target list of Russia.
He's talking about recent reports that Russia used a honey trap to persuade an unidentified opposition lawmaker there to push anti-NATO messages.
So bringing it to people's notice in order that they are alert in a way that societies have not been for a number of decades is absolutely crucial for heading off some of these attacks, especially if they start to scale up in the way that intelligence and security services seem to be predicting. But then, of course, there's the global response, the way to actually persuade Russia not to do it in the first place. And there it's a simple case of willingness to use whatever leverage Western countries have. Now, we don't see at the moment, at least not publicly reported, any spread of these kinds of attacks to, for example, the continental United States. And I think that's partly a byproduct of the fact that the Kremlin is acutely aware that the United States could lift some of the restrictions that it's placed on how Ukraine uses the weapon systems that have been supplied by the United States. It could do other things that would be distinctly unpalatable to Russia. The point is whether Western administrations would actually be willing to do that and demonstrate that Russian actions do have consequences, because if they do not, then we are on not only a slippery slope, but as clearly one that is accelerating rapidly. Things are moving at a pace that was faster than we anticipated before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine and even just a year ago. So deterrence at this point to head off these actions and to make sure that whatever leverage there is actually employed to dissuade Russia from escalating these further is absolutely crucial. And I think the most obvious place to deploy that leverage is in support of Ukraine.
All right. Go ahead, Andrea.
My wish list or dream response to many of these hybrid things would be that the United States and Europe would figure out how to collectivize a response. It's something that I've been thinking quite a lot about. And because to me, the problem seems to be that if there's an attack on Estonia, it's Tallinn's problem to deal with it. When it's on the UK, it's London. When it's France, it's Paris. And that's exactly as Putin would like it, because then the costs are acceptable. One example I had heard from some Estonian colleagues is they'll offer that, for example, the Russian Orthodox Church that sits in the middle of Tallinn, the land is owned by the Estonian government. So there could be something that they could do to confiscate the church. So could we go through and think of all of the religious, cultural, social, different kind of areas, things that the Kremlin would care about and might actually take notice. And then when something happens, there's a response amongst many allies, coordinated. We know in the reaction to the Skripal attempted poisoning and assassination, at the time, that coordinated response was something that certainly gained Russian notice.
This was a poisoning in the UK.
Exactly. And there was a very effectively coordinated response across multiple governments that I do think successfully got Moscow's attention. So are there things that we could do to identify some more creative points of leverage, have multiple countries respond so that we can try to raise the costs in a way that tries to convince the Russians that this is not, an effective approach?
For our final question, I asked, of course, about cyber and directed a question at Adam Siegel from the Council on Foreign Relations.
Adam, if you can talk about what we can do on the cyber front. I mean, should there be more hacking back? Should NSA be telling more people about what they're up to so that those consequences are clearer? What do you think?
Now, we are conducting a range of activities, as you said. So the NSA and Cyber Command are conducting what are called hunt forward operations. So at the invitation of a country, NSA goes to sit on their networks and help expose malware and attacks there. So exposing the malware, of course, makes it less useful. General Nakasone, who was head of NSA and Cyber Command before he left office, mentioned that we had conducted some offensive disruptive operations against Russian targets. We don't really know what that means.
I'm trying to find out.
Yes, I'll look forward to that podcast. That seems to, we don't really know how much of an effect that has had so far. I think, there was a lot of worry in the cyber realm, or the people that watch cyber, that those things were going to be escalatory, right? We were going to start hacking back, and that was going to push the Russians to do things that they hadn't done. That really doesn't seem to be the case. So, I don't really know how far we've gone, but it seems as if there's more runway than we expected on kind of disrupting those operations. But we also don't really know, when you take down a bunch of botnets, which are, computers that are taken over and controlled for command and control, how long does it take Russian operators to kind of either reconstruct or rebuild? It doesn't seem to be a significant amount of time, but it seems to have some slowing effect there.
The problem, of course, is these small calculated attacks in the real world face the same dilemma cyber attacks have in the virtual one, the possibility of a miscalculation. As long as these attacks remain just below the threshold of war, Moscow can use them to send a message. We can bring the war to your country too, it says. It isn't just Ukraine. You're all vulnerable.
Please join me in thanking Andrew, Max, Adam, and Kira for this great discussion today.
This is Click Here. Here are some of the top cyber and intelligence stories of the past week. The People's Liberation Army, or PLA, announced on Monday that it would begin conducting a large-scale military exercise around Taiwan. The exercise is called Joint Sword 2024, and it involves PLA ground, naval, air, and rocket forces, which will eventually, it says, encircle Taiwan. According to the PLA's Eastern Theater Command, the exercise will practice a close-in approach of Taiwan by ships and planes. It'll also include joint assault exercises, sea and land strikes, and what they call a seizure of comprehensive superiority, which likely means control over the battle space. Some 125 aircraft and 17 warships are thought to be taking part in the maneuvers. The body that coordinates the UK's national response to cyber threats said last week that the world should prepare for stepped-up cyber attacks by Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, or SVR. Britain's National Cybersecurity Center disclosed some 20 vulnerabilities that it has reason to believe that hackers from APT29, also known as Cozy Bear, are preparing to exploit. Cozy Bear is well known for
using malicious software in an attempt to steal information on vaccines.
The agency said the state hackers are trying to collect foreign intelligence for future cyber crimes and to support Russia's military efforts in Ukraine. They're scanning internet-facing systems for unpatched vulnerabilities and using good old-fashioned spear phishing campaigns, they said. Australia is set to require that companies tell government regulators about any ransomware payments they make. The new law is in a new cybersecurity bill introduced in the Australian Federal Parliament on Thursday. The new Cybersecurity Bill 2024 aims to align Australian cyber law with what is considered best practices in the rest of the world. But the part of the law that appears to have garnered the most attention is the strict reporting requirements on extortion payments to hackers. It would require businesses with annual turnover of more than $2 million to report ransomware payments to the Department of Home Affairs. Businesses that are impacted by an incident will only have to report to the government in case they or someone acting on their behalf makes a payment to the attackers. Those who fail to make a report within 73 hours of making an extortion payment will be subjected to a fine. The Internet's Library of Alexandria is on fire, sort of.
These stacks of servers represent a 20-year and running effort to build a kind of digital library and to essentially back up the ever-expanding World Wide Web.
The Internet Archive, a non-profit digital repository which holds decades of web pages, was struck by a major cyber attack last week. 31 million accounts were breached when the DDoS attack disrupted the site's Wayback Machine, where its backups are kept. The hackers left a sinister message suggesting the archive was easy to hack and, quote, run on sticks. And then they said they had broken into the archive in response to the U.S. government's support of Israel. And finally,
this year's prize is about machines that learn.
The first ever Nobel Prize in Physics for Artificial Intelligence has been awarded to Geoffrey Hinton and John Hopfield. Hinton, known as the godfather of artificial intelligence, and Hopfield, who laid the groundwork for Hinton's work, pioneered artificial neural networks, which allows a computer to mimic the way the human brain pieces things together. Hinton came to computer science by way of psychology. He developed a technique in the 80s that trained machines how to learn by fine-tuning errors until they disappear, while Hopfield, a Princeton physicist, created an associative memory program that stores and reconstructs images and patterns in data. Since AI has roared onto the stage, both Hinton and Hopfield have been very vocal about the need to regulate it, though they say they believe AI will revolutionize everything from productivity to healthcare.
Today's episode was produced by Megan Dietrich, Sean Powers, Erica Gaida, and me, Jade Abdul-Malik. It was edited by Karen Duffin, fact-checked by Darren Ancrum, and contains original music by Ben Livingston, with some other music from Blue Dot Sessions. Our staff writer is Lucas Riley, and our illustrator is Megan Goff. Martin Peralta is our sound designer and engineer. Click Here is a production of Recorded Future News. Tune in on Friday for Mic Drop, which features our favorite interview of the week. We'll have a new episode of Click Here on Tuesday. We'll see you then.